Hi, storyteller. Why do we tell stories? I don't mean you and me personally, but us as humans. A lot of species have developed communication systems of varying complexity. If you, like me, live with tiny predatory mammals, you'll know they're quite good at meowing, hissing, headbutting, and in general communicating their goals and boundaries. But humans are the only species that has evolved narrative storytelling, including completely fictional storytelling. We make stuff up about people and events that never happened, and we also willingly and knowingly lap up those fictions as readers. So, why do we do such a peculiar thing? When I was getting my MFA in fiction, I often ran into the framing that stories are about change. We are drawn to change and we write to capture moments of transformation. While there is something to that, I'll be the first to admit that for years I've produced some atrociously bad writing by following that framing. I've also seen it muddy the stories of many writing peers and clients. And that's mainly because we as humans are not primarily drawn to stories for the change that happens in them. Saying that stories are about change is like saying that fire trucks are about sirens. Yes, fire trucks can and often do generate sirens, but it's in service of another goal. Change in stories is the same as a siren. It happens as a byproduct of a bigger, more important goal. And that more important goal? Well, if we have to put it into a pithy one-liner, it would be that stories are about character decisions. The not pithy one-liner is the rest of this video, in which I will cover the psychology of why we're drawn to people's decisions, the three narrative elements that are most important if you want your story to be engaging based on our psychology, and I'll provide some examples so that it's clear how these can be implemented in your own writing. Let's dig in. I mentioned we're the only species that has evolved narrative storytelling, and when you think about it, that is a pretty complex and resource-intensive behavior. So if we bothered to develop it, it means it really helped our ancestors survive. Now, cognitive and evolutionary understanding of fiction is a rich field of study, so for our purposes, I'm going to touch on only two aspects that are directly relevant to writers of fiction. The first aspect is that we evolved storytelling to learn from one another. If you hear a story about great-grandpa eating a specific type of berry and dying instantly, not only do you not have to repeat that mistake yourself, but you don't even have to witness anyone in your generation having to die for you to learn the importance of not eating those berries. Having the wisdom of many brains has an obvious survival advantage. The second important aspect is that because we are a highly social species, our communication focus and our storytelling is deeply concerned with people. Navigating people when you live in large groups of people is essential for success and survival. So it makes sense that we are very keen to pay attention to social information. It helps us learn who is a potential ally, who might be an enemy, who might be a good mate, who will help us, who will betray us, and so on. This all in turn helps us figure out how to behave around those people so that we can reach our own goals. It's pretty clear how this is also a survival advantage. In short, our story software is deeply interested in learning and absolutely obsessed with people. These two mean that when we consume stories, we are really engaged when we're learning about why people are doing what they're doing. This is why I said that the pithy one-liner is that stories are about character decisions. A slightly more accurate way of framing this is that if we strip storytelling down to its very essence, neurologically speaking, stories are simulations about what decisions are worth making in life. Their biggest evolutionary advantage is that by virtue of following characters, we get to sort of rehearse what happens if we were to make a certain choice in a certain circumstance, all from the safety of our own brains. We get to safely figure out social information like when kindness might hide ulterior motives, like when the pain of love is worth the joys and benefits of connection, like whose berry cobbler is safe to eat, and a ton more deeply memorable insights into life. We get to walk in others' shoes and learn from their experience. I hope this provides some clarity on why character decisions are our primary focus of interest in stories. We are literally wired to want to learn about people. But it's one thing to understand some of this psychology, and it's another to translate it into stories. So let's look at what this all means for how to best actually hook readers with your own story. I doubt I need to tell you that long-form stories like novels and even novellas are quite complex creatures. For them to be baseline readable, let alone moving and memorable, an approximate megaton of skillfully executed narrative elements all have to work together. So I'm not saying, if you do just this one thing, you'll have a bestseller nailed down. But I am saying that because of the underlying psychology that we covered, some narrative elements are more load-bearing than others, especially if you want to really have a solid, engaging story. So here are 3 of these key elements. 1. Trade-off decisions. If stories are simulations about what decisions are worth making in life, the big decision points your character encounters, and especially the key decision of the story's climax, have to be trade-off decisions. Remember, we said that we as humans are really interested in learning from a story. Well, if a decision has an obvious choice, that's not really letting us learn anything. If I asked you if you'd rather receive electric shocks or eat ice cream with your best friend, I suspect you'd scream out an answer after the word ice cream. That's a no-brainer. We as humans are exquisitely good at choosing pleasant, comfortable things over difficult and uncomfortable things. This is why a romance where a protagonist has to pick between the deadbeat, unattractive love interests she has nothing in common with and the rich, attractive one who shares all her interests would be deeply disengaging to readers. There is no trade-off. If she picks the rich one, we're bored because it's a no-brainer. Our minds are well adept at these simple and easy decisions. If she picks the deadbeat, we are at least bored and possibly upset, because it's just not a choice that resembles a decision a human would make. It's not accurate social information and it feels wrong based on what we already know about the world. So our brain rejects it as a useful simulation. For us to be engaged, there needs to be a trade-off point. We like understanding why and how people decide what to do in tricky situations that don't have an obvious right answer. That's why many romances give protagonists the choice between an attractive deadbeat that she has a lot in common with and an attractive rich love interest that she has nothing in common with. Now, understanding how she'll choose here, that engages us because there are pros and cons in each category. She wins some, she loses some. It's a trade-off. You can also think of this trade-off as there must be a price that the character has to pay in order to get what they want. How big that price is depends on the genre that you're writing in. In high-stakes genres, the price can be death and the ruin of your character's entire family lineage for generations to come. In lower stakes genres, the price could be your character realizing that he should abandon the dream of that berry farm because his heart is just no longer in it. Now, you might be wondering how many overall decision points throughout your story should be these tricky trade-off decisions. The answer to that also depends on the genre that you're writing in. In general, the more of the tricky decision scenes that you have in your story, the more tense, urgent, and fast-paced your story will feel. So thrillers as a genre tend to be filled with them. Cozy genres, like cozy fantasy, tend to have the least of them, which is in part what contributes to that cozy vibe. So the answer is that it depends on what you're going for. But even in the cozy genres, to give the reader a satisfying, engaging payoff, your climactic character decision, or decisions, depending on how long your story is, really should be a trade-off decision. There should be some price to pay. The second element of engagement is related to this trade-off concept, and it is that the reader must understand the stakes that your protagonist is facing. And by stakes, I mean, what does the character stand to gain or lose from a decision that they have to make? This may seem obvious, but I often find it missing in manuscripts and even in some published work. Knowing the potential consequences of each decision is the part that allows us to actually simulate these decisions in our own heads. That's the stuff that gets reader engagement fired up. If we don't understand why a character is choosing to do something, what they're choosing to prioritize or sacrifice, we have a hard time following the story and paying attention. To pull this off well in your own writing, you have to make sure that the reader understands the stakes before the character makes the decision. So have the reader learn what's at stake when the character learns it, or even before. Because if the reader learns what was at stake after the decision was made, this will almost always disengage them from the story. It kicks us out of experiencing the story. There can be an exception to this order of operations when you're creating a mystery, but even then, the reader has to have a very plausible guess at what the stakes are, even if those stakes turn out to have been wrong later on. Let's make this all a little bit more concrete with an example of missing stakes. I was reading a novel recently where a character was trying to murder the protagonist early on. I don't like this book, so I'm not going to name it, but let's call the protagonist Maria and the would-be murderer Alice. Alice failed to murder Maria, but they both end up in a sort of labor camp with a whole bunch of other people. They don't really interact on account of, the murdering, and they definitely don't hang out one-on-one. And then Maria becomes really romantically interested in Alice and begins seeking her out one-on-one. And if you're thinking that I'm clearly leaving something out regarding her motivation, rest assured, I'm not. And yes, I was also confused reading this. Like, why did Maria suddenly go from, wow, you tried to murder me, I'm gonna stay away from you, to, wow, you seem a really cool person that I'd like to get to know? Maria's actions made zero sense and did ultimately make me want to put the book down. I just didn't understand why she was deciding to do what she was doing, and I didn't understand because there were no clear stakes. Given the context that the story established, there was nothing that Maria would stand to gain by seeking Alice out one-on-one, and nothing she would stand to lose by not becoming involved with her. It was just out of nowhere. I feel this is often the symptom of an author operating from the stories are about change framework. The author clearly needed for something to change at this point of the story to propel the plot forward. But while change may propel plots, decisions propel change. And change without a decision point is like a siren without a fire. At best annoying, at worst we shut the book forever so we don't have to hear it anymore. I'm curious, have you encountered a similarly disengaging part in a story? Something that just changed out of nowhere and had you going, what? If so, drop it in the comments and let us know how you would suggest fixing it. As for me, here's how I would fix the Maria Alice example. I would just add stakes. Let's say that Maria, who is very driven to excel in the labor camp, gains the favor of the camp supervisors and gets assigned to an easier shift. But workers aren't allowed to do solo shifts, so she gets to pick one more person who gets the cushy job with her. Suddenly, a lot of the other laborers are trying to be her best friend, but it's Alice who makes her an offer that she cannot refuse. Now, the details of that offer, they would need to fit the world and genre and Maria's character goals. For the sake of argument, let's say this is a world in which magic is highly prized and Maria really needs to know more magic in order to officially climb the labor camp ranks. So let's have Alice offer to teach Maria a secret magic technique that only Alice knows. And if this story's genre is low stakes, let's say she even does it under a truth spell so that Maria knows that there will be no more attempted murder. Now the stakes are clear. We understand what Maria would have to gain from spending time with Alice and how she'd lose the chance to advance if she didn't spend time with her. We might even be eager to see if this whole time spending will reveal why Alice tried to murder her in the first place. And voila, the enemies to Lover's Trope actually has legs to stand on now. The bottom line is that understanding what a character has to gain or lose from a choice helps us make sense of why they're making that choice. And we love that. It keeps us reading. And the third and final load-bearing narrative element that engages our underlying psychology concerns the outcome. The reader has to understand if the decision was worth it or not, especially the final climactic decision that all the others build toward. Now, I will say this is much more hard and fast in novels and novellas, so longer form fiction. In short stories and flash fiction, your ending can get away with some other functions sometimes, in some cases. But overall, readers really like to know if the decisions were worth it to the characters. The emphasis here is on the character's reaction. An outcome might be bad for a given definition of bad, but if the character is at least content with it, it gives us the social information that we need to fully process that simulation of the story. Similarly, the outcome might be objectively good, but if the character isn't happy with it based on their goals and motivations, that's the information that the reader needs to be engaged. To make this a bit more concrete, let's look at The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins as an example. I suspect you're familiar with the story, but in case you're not, spoiler alert. Katniss Everdeen lives in a dystopia where every year children are sent as tributes to a death match, known as the Hunger Games, and there can only be one tribute who wins the games. In this story, Katniss and her friend Peeta are the final two people living, and one has to kill the other to win the game. That's the big climactic, tricky decision. Katniss is choosing between her life or, quite frankly, her humanity. So there's a trade-off. The reader is also aware of the stakes. On the one hand, she dies. On the other, she becomes a monster who killed her friend. What will she choose? Katniss, as we all know, refuses to kill Peeta, but because he also refuses to kill her, she decides to give them both highly poisonous nightlock berries to eat in unison, so there will be no victor to the games at all. Was this decision worth making? Well, this decision forces the game organizers to change the rules at the last moment, and both Katniss and Peeta survive. And the reader gets to learn that Katniss is pretty pleased about getting to both live and not kill her friend. So yes, this decision was worth it to her. Yes, she now has to deal with a dystopian regime being pretty mad at her for forcing their hand, but it's clear to the reader she stands by her choice. I firmly believe that one of the reasons Hunger Games was so successful, and this scene in particular so iconic, is because it had all three of these load-bearing narrative elements. The big decision had big trade-offs. The reader was aware of what the characters stood to gain or lose before the big decision was being made. And it was clear how the characters felt about the outcomes of their decision. There, of course, is a lot more that goes into an effective, meaningful story. So if you want more such videos about storycraft, subscribe to the channel. I post weekly videos. And if you found this particular video valuable, give it a like. My name is Tina. I'm a writer, writing coach, and recovering academic. Until next time, write on.